economic globalization and the agriculture sector, the gains and the losses. In any large supermarket, a single shelf can hold produce from 4 continents. Coffee, soybeans, corn, and even flour, all created and exported from various corners of the world. This is the everyday result of a system called economic globalization. That system has made food cheaper and more plentiful than at any other time in history. Meanwhile, it has also pushed some of the world's smallest farms out of business and put developing countries' agriculture markets at risk of disappearing due to growing monopolies of agribusiness that control the trading of goods. Both of those things can be true at once. The question worth asking is who gains and who loses when food becomes a global commodity. Economic globalization is the growing integration of national economies, linked by trade, investment, and the movement of capital. The basic logic is simple. Goods are produced wherever they cost the least, then shipped and sold across the world. Several forces drove the shift. For decades, transport and communication costs fell, until moving a ton of grain across the world became remarkably cheap. Better storage and preservation allowed food to travel further without spoiling. Trade agreements lowered tariffs and opened national markets. Comparative advantage did the rest. 2 trade agreements stand out as turning points in the solidification of this system. First is the 1994 Uruguay Round, which created the World Trade Organization, and with it, the Agreement on Agriculture. Regional deals followed, including the North American Free Trade Agreement. Together, these rules reshaped how food is grown, priced, and moved around the planet. It would be a mistake to ignore that the benefits of this system have been substantial. But every new system carries downsides, and this one was uneven by design. Developing countries were pressed to open their markets to imports, while the wealthier countries kept large subsidies for their own farmers. Critics argue this tilted the benefits toward rich nations from the start. It wasn't only food that started to move across nations, but capital. Foreign firms invested in farmland, processing plants, and distribution networks. Supply chains grew longer and more tightly managed, and supermarkets spread quickly across Asia and Latin America. Supporters and critics look at the same system and describe it in opposite terms. Supporters see an efficient global market that feeds more people for less money. Critics see a model that rewards capital and scale at the expense of small producers and local economies. Both descriptions capture part of the truth, and both are important to consider when imagining future policy. The most obvious gain is cheaper and more plentiful food. For decades, global farm output has grown faster than populations can consume, and research tied to the Food and Agriculture Organization makes a striking point. The world now produces more food than it actually needs. In real terms, prices have rarely been lower. Cheap food helps consumers everywhere, but it matters most to the poorest households, who spend a large share of their income simply on eating. For them, cheaper staples can be the difference between hunger and having enough. Economic globalization allowed the rapid spread of technology across borders. Improved seeds, better machinery, and modern methods raised yields in region after region. And knowledge that once took decades to spread now moves in a few years. Specialization lets countries focus on the crops their land and climate suited best. Open trade widened the choice on the shelf, too. Fresh produce became available year-round rather than only in season, and when one region's harvest failed, imports could help fill the gap. Some, not all developing countries, turned this into a real advantage. Vietnam entered the global grain trade and became one of the world's leading rice exporters. Later, it moved into coffee and pepper, where local firms now process and brand the goods rather than shipping out raw beans. Others built their success on higher value crops. Kenya, Chile, Costa Rica, Thailand, and South Africa expanded exports of fruit, vegetables, and flowers. Brazil grew into a farm export giant, shipping vast quantities of soybeans to China. Guatemalan coffee earned fair trade certification and reached wealthier markets. These industries created jobs and lifted rural incomes, and many smallholders joined export supply chains and saw real gains from them. The global market's expectations for quality products also pushed farms towards higher standards. Future demand for an array of products looks large. The United States Department of Agriculture predicts that a lot of the products will start coming from developing countries who have become the central exporters of multiple products. That creates real openings for efficient trade systems. Though developing countries have reaped some benefits, it is safe to say that it was the largest agribusinesses that gained the most. Their scale, capital, and global logistics drove costs down, and much of that efficiency reached shoppers as lower prices. This made them leaders in the trade of various products and the controllers of product consumption. The benefits are many, but like any system, there will be holes which leave many having to deal with the adverse effects. The losses fell hardest on small farmers in poorer or developing countries who had to compete against imports and agribusiness sold produce in the market that often cost less than their own produce. Small farms had limited options without the additional support of their governments. Wealthy nations have the advantage that they are able to support their farmers on an enormous scale. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development tracks this support. Across the 54 countries it monitors, that support averaged more than $800 billion a year between 2021 and 2023. China provides the largest share, followed by the United States, India, and the European Union. Poorer governments cannot come anywhere close to that kind of spending. Support also varies widely from place to place. On average, it equals about 9% of farm revenue, but in Norway, it reaches roughly half of all farm receipts. In India, by contrast, policy has often pushed food prices down, which cuts farmers' revenue rather than raising it. That makes competition far from fair. One consequence is a practice known as dumping. Dumping means exporting goods below what they cost to produce. The Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy has tracked this for years. By its analysis, the United States sold corn, soybeans, wheat, rice, and cotton below the cost in many of the years after NAFTA took effect. The margins ran from 5 to 40%. Mexico shows the pattern most clearly. Before NAFTA, the country imported only about 7% of its corn. By 2022, that share had climbed to roughly 38%. United States corn shipments to Mexico rose sharply after 1994. They went from an average of about 1.6 million tons before the deal to several times that within a few years. The effect on Mexican farmers was severe. Domestic corn prices fell by more than half, and some analyses put the drop closer to 70%. Many small growers simply could not survive it. The damage, in terms of capital and money, puts Mexican corn farmers at about $3.8 billion loss between 2014 and 2020. Wheat farmers lost a further $2.1 billion over the same period. Mexico did try to soften the blow, spending around $20 billion on farm support between 1994 and 2009. But the earlier programs that had guaranteed prices were already gone, and many farmers left the land anyway, moving to the cities or migrating north for work. Economists continue to argue over how much of that shift trade alone caused. Domestic policy, recession, and currency shocks all played a part, and the link between cheap corn and migration remains contested. The pattern reaches well beyond Mexico. Subsidized European milk powder has undercut dairy farmers in parts of West Africa. Cotton support in wealthy nations has faced the same charge, with low-cost African growers arguing that it depresses the world price they receive. Depending on just a few export crops carries a further danger. World prices for coffee, cocoa, or cotton can swing sharply, and a single steep fall can erase a grower's income in one season. Farmers tied to one global crop carry that risk directly. Globalization changed not only how farmers sell, but what they choose to grow. Markets reward uniform, high-yield crops that travel and store well, and traditional varieties, bred over many generations, tend to lose out. The result is a food supply built on remarkably few species. The Food and Agricultural Organization reports that around a dozen plants supply most of what humans eat, and adding just 5 animal species nearly completes the picture. About 20 crops provide close to 90% of the world's food. Diversity has narrowed sharply over time. The same organization has estimated that roughly three-quarters of crop genetic diversity was lost between 1900 and 2000. That figure is quoted very widely, though researchers caution that it is hard to measure with precision. India offers a vivid example. A country that once grew tens of thousands of rice varieties now plants only a handful across most of its fields. Mexico offers another. Its native maize types, known as land races, carry deep cultural and genetic value, and cheap imported commodity corn places that heritage under real strain. Several forces sit behind the trend. The Green Revolution spread a small set of high-yield seeds. Changing diets pushed demand towards fewer staples. Patents and seed rules nudged farmers towards certified commercial varieties, and global markets reinforced every part of it. The narrowing carries a hidden cost. Diverse crops resist pests, disease, and climate stress more reliably, while a single uniform variety can fail across an entire region at once. Smallholders who plant many types add resilience to the wider food supply. The response, so far, has been partly defensive. Gene banks now store seeds against future loss, and in 2008, the Svalbard Global Seed Vault opened in Norway to guarantee the crop diversity that working fields no longer hold. Across the whole economy, macroeconomics helps explain why the picture stays mixed. Cheap food hurts the farmers who sell it and helps everyone who buys it. The real divide runs between net sellers and net buyers. Net sellers lose when import prices fall, while net buyers gain. Net buyers are mostly poor, urban communities who cannot afford much else. In most countries, buyers far outnumber sellers, which means cheaper food tends to help the majority while hurting those who farm. The gains are uneven even among the winners. Within a single country, large and well-funded farms usually capture them first, while smallholders may lack the credit, the scale, or the connections to compete. The same holds between countries. The Food and Agriculture Organization notes that liberalization tends to reward the strongest exporters most. Richer developing nations in Asia and Latin America capture much of the benefit, while the poorest and least competitive often gain very little. There is a longer-term risk, one that economists Raoul Prebisch and Hans Singer first described decades ago. The prices of raw commodities tend to fall over time against the price of manufactured goods. Countries that export only raw crops can slowly lose ground as their terms of trade weaken. Heavy reliance on imports brings its own danger, too. A nation that stops growing its own staples becomes dependent on world prices. Those prices can spike without warning, as the global food crisis of 2007 and 2008 made clear. In theory, comparative advantage should reward every side. In practice, the theory runs into hard friction from subsidies, weak infrastructure, and concentrated market power. Local conditions decide who actually feels a change in price. Poor roads and a long chain of intermediaries can absorb the difference. In one study, the gap between the farm price and the market price was enormous. For cassava in Mozambique, that margin reached around 300%. A cheaper world price, in other words, may never reach the farmer or the family buying dinner. The policy around agriculture is wide and complicated. It involves many moving parts that make finding an answer all the more difficult. Some think that ending all developed country support would fix everything. However, this theory has holes. The Food and Agricultural Organization estimates ending the support to developed countries would actually raise some world food prices. The likely rise is 5 to 20% for temperate crops, which would help exporting farmers but hurt poor families who buy food. For that reason, most economists favor reform paired with support. That means rural roads, credit, training, and safety nets that help farmers adjust instead of just collapsing. Open markets work far better when people can actually respond to them. The globalization of agricultural products has produced both large gains and serious harm. It has fed billions of people and driven prices down across the world. Nevertheless, it concentrated profit and exposed the most vulnerable farmers to shocks beyond their control. The benefits are real, and so are the costs. Which side weighs heavier, in the end, depends on the rules that societies choose to set.